wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be here on the first of our centenary events. I want to begin proceedings by acknowledging and paying respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the university is built, and in all of our teaching and research, I think it's really important, especially in architecture and cultural heritage, that we consider and acknowledge that there is a deep Aboriginal connection to country from which we can learn and which we should acknowledge and find, as my colleague Kevin O'Brien says, to find country always in places and to have Aboriginal people assist us with finding country. I also want to acknowledge our partners, the university's partners for the event. Sorry, I'm Dr. Cameron Logan. I'm from the School of Architecture here at the University of Sydney. And I want to acknowledge our partners for the event tonight, DoCoMoMo Australia and ICOMOS Australia, especially to Scott Robertson and Louise Cox from DoCoMoMo, and Karen Danis and Bruce Dorban and Mary Knaggs from ICOMOS. This is part of a series that DoCoMoMo and ICOMOS run every year of events and talks, and this is part of that series, and we're really proud to be partnering with them to present John Allan's lecture tonight. We're all the beneficiaries at the University of Sydney. ICOMOS and DoCoMoMo are all beneficiaries of the generosity of the University of Melbourne, under the aegis of the McGeorge Fellowship, have brought John Allan to our shores. And so thank you to them, and in particular to my colleague in Melbourne, Professor Hannah Louie, who made that happen. And I should also just note, the School of Architecture itself, and to Professor John Redman, our Dean and Head, for supporting the event, and in particular to the events team, Zoe Skinner, Christina, Rita and Matilda McGahey, who have organised tonight and done such a wonderful job with that. Thank you to all of you. And just a brief word on the School of Architecture. It is a special occasion for us tonight because this is the first in a series of events to celebrate the centenary of the school, or in fact, what we're celebrating really is 100 years since Leslie Wilkinson was appointed as the first Professor of Architecture at the University of Sydney and initiated and developed what would become and what is today the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And as many of you as graduates of the school will know, it's had its moments, both good and bad, but I think it's absolutely, and it's shaped sort of orthodoxies, and it's upended orthodoxies, the students and the school itself in architecture and planning. But what is undeniable is that the school has shaped architecture and planning in Sydney and in Australia quite profoundly. And this year we're going to reflect upon that, and we're going to celebrate that with a series of events. And indeed, we're going to also then celebrate later in the year with some events that look forward as well as look back upon the legacy and look forward upon the prospect for architecture at the University of Sydney, the prospect for architecture in our region, and for our city. So stay tuned for announcements and things about the series of events that we'll have this year. There'll be a book and various other things, a series of talks, of which we're the first this evening. Okay, to get to the subject of why we're all here, which is of course John Allan. And to many of you, John, who you can see up here, needs no introduction. He's been a regular visitor to Australia over the past decade or so, and is a familiar face to those of you who attend various conferences and symposia focused on 20th century architecture and legacy of modernism and so forth. And where John is always, the most eloquent and indeed elegant voice at those events. And with his firm Avanti Architecture, John has done more than anyone else to preserve the work of Berthold Lubetkin, the other person you can see in the picture up here, and the work of Lubetkin's firm Tecton. But it's the manner in which John has preserved that legacy, I think, that's most that sets him apart from most architects and indeed most scholars. Because what is really sort of extraordinary in John's work is this dual legacy that not only of conserving and restoring some of Lubetkin's great masterpieces, but also the research that John has done to underpin that work, which has been published in his Berthold Lubetkin Architecture in the Tradition of Progress. And if you didn't pick up a flyer for John's book, it's been a new edition of that book has been published, well, some 5 years ago now, but it's a great, it's a sort of magisterial work of scholarship, really, and I would commend it to all of you. I think what's most fascinating about this is precisely this engagement that John has as scholar and practitioner, which informed that work, informed the restoration and conservation of Lubetkin's work, but also informed this great work of scholarship. And the two things working hand in hand, I think, is a great example. One that I'd almost dare to set for my own students, because it's really almost impossible for them to have such an ambition to be such a quality scholar. So I mention all of this without even touching upon the range of non-Lubetkin things John has done, but I'm conscious that you're here to listen to him, and so please join me in welcoming John Allan.
Thank you very much, Cameron, and indirectly thank you to all of your partners and supporters who've been instrumental in making this evening possible. It's a huge honour for me to be standing here in front of you all, particularly as this, I gather, is the first event in this centenary programme. So I'm thrilled to be here and very honoured to be opening your series of events. I hope what I can do in the space of about 40 minutes is try and convey something of my fascination and passion for this architect, Berthold Lubetkin, who I was privileged to know for 20 years. This picture was taken in the mid to late 1980s, over 30 years ago, which possibly explains the almost imperceptible difference between the person standing here and the person standing in front of you now. But Lubetkin has somehow or another been with me one way or another for all of my professional life and for a good part of my student life as well. So if I can convey something of that obsession virtually, then I will be very gratified. I have sort of structured my talk in two parts. The first part representing about 2/3 of the material. The last part, which I hope will still be feasible if I manage my time properly, will say a little bit about a couple of the projects that I've been involved in restoring Lubetkin's, well, two of Lubetkin's premier works. But I want to introduce Lubetkin really prior to his arrival in England. He was one of this illustrious group of immigrants who arrived in England towards the end of the 1920s or in the early 1930s, which totally illuminated the practice of architecture in our country. You may recognize some of the faces and probably many of the names in that photograph, specifically two of your near locals, Amias Connell and Basil Ward from New Zealand, who I was also privileged to meet and know quite well. Ove Arup is someone who I'm sure is very familiar to you here in Sydney, and so on. And Lubetkin was, if anything, as exotic and interesting as any of those people. His background goes all the way to Georgia, below Russia, still a colony of Russia at that stage. And he used to say that one of the great advantages of being born in the back of beyond was that issues which had been already settled elsewhere in Europe or even in Russia were back in Georgia still the subject of discussion, as though there was an open choice to us as to which way we could go. And the two key choices that appeared to be open to them at that stage was whether to, as it were, move with the rising tide of technological progress and the sort of all of the bounty of advanced thought and technology that was coming from Europe, or whether that would signify a sort of an alienation from ancient Russian traditions and folklore and risk alienating these traditions that had gone back centuries. In fact, one of the fascinating things I found about Lubetkin is the way in which he somehow managed to fuse some of these ancient traditions and sort of almost Eastern folklore with the most advanced technological solutions that were available to architects at the time. So in a sense, he didn't make that choice. He managed to fuse those ideas. And as he often used to say, history and the past is not something you either copy or ignore. It's something you have to try and metabolize. And Lubetkin's work, I feel, somehow succeeds in metabolizing the past and the present. These are really just placeholders to try and give you an indication of that sort of slightly Eastern flavor, which we'll see later on in the presentation. His parents here, Fenya and Roman Lubetkin, were relatively prosperous, by no means rich people, but who were quite successful in their own way. Lubetkin's father was an engineer and a maker of watches who at one point supplied instruments to the state railway company. And they did a lot of traveling. Lubetkin had visited several countries before he came to England to make his career there. And he mastered languages very quickly. As George Steiner used to say about Jewish people, it's not so much that they learn languages, language passes through them. And Lubetkin was totally fluent in so many cultures and languages, and one can somehow trace that back to these early origins. His own account as to how he became involved in an artistic calling was, as I've said in that quotation, as far as I can remember, it all started when, spellbound, I watched a grown-up finger meandering amongst the lion-headed serpents in the rainless gardens of a wall carpet. And of course, carpets were a very significant part of the local tradition in the Caucasus, and we're going to come across carpets several times later on in the presentation. But of course, the big event in Lubetkin's life, in his early life, was the Russian Revolution, which literally broke out outside his bedroom window when he was living in Moscow. He was still quite young at this stage, of course, 17 or so, 16, 17, but he entirely immersed himself in the ferment and the turmoil of that extraordinary event. And I suppose the slogan that synthesizes that, ferment was this idea that art was not a branch of the entertainment industry. It was something at the center of the revolution, something that would assist the revolution, could serve the revolution. And architecture was itself something that would serve as an instrument of social progress. And although Lubetkin's architectural personality was still unformed at this stage, that idea, which he became embedded in his outlook and in his aspiration, stayed with him for the rest of his life, and to some extent was the cause of some of his later disillusionment, because he could see that some of those early ideals were not being fulfilled. And these, again, are sort of placeholders, in a sense, just to convey the energy of that early period, the optimistic period of the revolution, when art was pressed into the service of the revolutionary program. He attended the Vutamas school in Moscow briefly, and then also the Svomas studios, which existed in Moscow and Petersburg. And he said there was really no material to work with. We had to invent stuff out of nothing. But it was a period when nothing was certain, but everything seemed possible. And some of these images can perhaps convey that sense of inventiveness and experimentation, which was a key part of his early self-education. And self-education is very much the theme of the next 10 years of his life. He left Russia in 1922 and spent the next 10 years traveling around Europe in this rather amazing journey that you can see here. And over that period turned himself really from being an avid student of the revolution into a professional architect. He started in Berlin. He accompanied the first exhibition of Russian art, which traveled to Berlin in 1922. He acted as an interpreter in that capacity. And interestingly, during that period, he was only in Berlin for a few months, made some very significant choices of what to study after the exhibition finished. One choice was the study of concrete, which he proceeded to do under Professor Kirsten, who was then a leading German academic and practitioner of reinforced concrete. And he absorbed this tome, Der Eisenbettenbau, which was the sort of most authoritative book on the practice of reinforced concrete. His other choice was carpets again, and he studied at the Berlin Textile Academy under Professor Wilhelm Worringer, where carpets again were the subject of investigation, which he understood really not so much as a decorative accessory, but more as a kind of social analog of the places where carpets were made, that these stylized motifs were sort of codified storytelling of the communities and the different locations where carpets were made. And this was made a very profound impact on him at that time. He was soon on his travels again. He went to Warsaw for about 18 months and studied at the Warsaw Polytechnic. He had mastered the 3-year course in about 15 months, and the staff there said, there's really no point in you staying here. He was already teaching students and had nothing left to learn, at least at Warsaw. And they said, get to Paris. That's where you will be able to complete your education. And he arrived in Paris in 1925 at the exact moment of the huge exhibition, the International Exposition of Industrial and Decorative Arts. Everybody was there. This must have been the biggest party in Europe. And of course, two people there that made a considerable impression on him were firstly Le Corbusier, whose pavilion d'Esprit Nouveau was being built almost exactly opposite the Soviet pavilion by Konstantin Melnikov, which Lubetkin actually had a hand in helping to construct. There was a young group of Russians who helped put this thing together. It was entirely made of wood, and again, made a big impression on him, specifically this diagonal arrangement of the plan, which again, we're going to see in a number of other applications. But keep that image in mind. The other absolutely crucial influence on Lubetkin at this time was the French architect Auguste Perret, probably the foremost French practitioner of reinforced concrete architecture, as distinct from engineering. I mean, people, of course, were familiar with the use of reinforced concrete as an engineering medium, but Auguste Perret had really exalted it and turned it into a medium that was capable of considerable architectural effect. And you can see some of those images there, specifically the church at the bottom, Notre Dame du Rancy, which was finished in about 1924, which was possibly the most ambitious use of reinforced concrete, certainly in a religious building at that time. Lubetkin attended his seminars and his design tuition sessions and said he followed them to the letter. There was something about Auguste Perret's insistence on attending to all of the details one has to think about and draw in the process of realizing a building. And that sort of conscientiousness, that link with the French rationalist tradition, is something that we will see running through all of his work. Of course, at this stage, there was no certainty that he would not simply return to Russia when he had completed his tour. The idea was that he would learn the technical experience that was difficult or impossible to gain in Russia at that time and bring it back to Russia and become an architect in the Soviet program. And to that end, he remained in tune with Soviet developments. Some of these projects you see here are entries for competitions, including the Palace of Soviets competition, which everybody went in for. That's the image along the bottom there. Huge, huge scheme. Lubetkin actually won a premium for his entry. As we know, of course, that was not built, and indeed even the winning entry was not built. But it was an important way of him keeping in touch with Soviet developments. His first real experience of building was in curating this series of trade pavilions for the Russian trade delegation. This was really part of Russia trying to re-establish economic links across Europe, and this demountable pavilion was erected and demounted and then re-erected in about half a dozen French cities and made a considerable impact. But you can perhaps see that the way in which the roof is arranged is a sort of an enlarged version of the canopy that occurred over the Melnikov Pavilion in the 1925 exhibition. So Lubetkin was learning his trade fast. And what might be called his sort of graduation project is this really extraordinarily advanced building in Avenue de Versailles in the 16th arrondissement in Paris, which he completed with the slightly younger Polish architect, Jan Ginsberg, in 1931. And you have to remember that both architects were under 30 when they accomplished this building. I'm not going to describe it in detail, but there are just a couple of points which I just can't resist pointing out to you, which give some indication of Lubetkin's ingenuity and the sort of the thought given to enhancing the amenity, the common parts and so on of an apartment building. It was a very difficult site. In fact, the priority is given to this area. That represents one flat of the plan, and at the rear you get this much smaller studio flat. And of course, the stair core is buried in the middle of the plan, so how to light this, how to prevent it just becoming just a rather dismal staircase? Well, their way of doing that was to bring light in through the lift shaft, which is actually treated as an 8-story glazed lantern, and then borrowing it again back into the stair core. Just beautifully worked out. Another lovely detail, I think, is the way the windows are operated. Here you have a vertical sliding sash, despite the fact that the ratio of the window is very horizontal, but it was perfectly balanced. And the idea was that can you see that? That both sashes would slide down into a cavity behind the spandrel with a fold-over sill, which in effect turned the main living room into a sort of balcony. And this was really one of the problems that modern architects were looking to address, namely how off-the-ground living in apartment blocks could be designed in such a way as to retain some sort of connection to the ground. I mean, clearly, the higher the building went, the further away you were from ground level and nature and the gardens and so forth. But this was a way in which Lubetkin was trying to re-establish some meaningful connection between the inside and the outside, and it's very, very beautifully done. So there's the building as it is now, very valuable. I mean, no one could probably afford to, well, no, I know I couldn't afford to live in this building now, but it's still in pretty good order and a remarkable testament to the ambition of two architects who, as I say, were still under 30. So just to sum up this intro, here we have just a sort of a selection. I could have put other images and people in, but this gives you some idea of the richness of Lubetkin's extraordinary period of self-education from Russia right through to the point at which he was about to leave Paris. So here we have him arriving in England in 1931. Perhaps that image of cricketers isn't so appropriate. Anyway, why England? Why, of all countries, would Lubetkin choose to come to England? Well, as I said already, the choice was not made with any sense of finality. It was still quite conceivable that he would have returned to Russia at this stage. However, England did offer some considerable opportunities. There were no rivals. Modern architecture had hardly been heard of or started. There might be 2 buildings that could have been roughly described as modern movement buildings. He was also attracted by the traditions of tolerance that, at least to an outsider, were represented in English social history and background. He used to say that that slogan, which was bandied around after the First World War, "Homes for Heroes," which was what the Lloyd George government had promised soldiers returning from the front, that idea that they were going to be pressed into service to do socially useful architecture appealed to him greatly. And as he described it, although England seemed about 30 years behind, lost in a deep provincial sleep, it nevertheless seemed like a country that was perhaps just about to change its rules. And that idea, that sort of feeling that he was coming to the beginning of something, just as he had experienced at the Russian Revolution, that society was something that could be changed and architecture would have a role in effecting that change, was a strong attraction to him to come to England. He formed a practice almost effortlessly within a matter of weeks of arriving here with 6 graduates of the Architectural Association School. This picture actually dates from about 1938, by which time some of the original partners had left. But this was a very unusual way of practicing, to form a group of this size and work in a cooperative manner, although it has to be said that Lubetkin was easily the first among equals. All of the original partners who I met and talked to, of course, said that Lubetkin was easily and quite obviously the leader of the group. He'd had experience of building, his sense of purpose and his sort of dynamic personality and his charismatic charm meant that he was the leader from the very start. And the other person who we have to introduce at this point, of course, is Ove Arup, again, who at this stage was working as a contractor's estimator with the firm Christiani and Nielsen, a civil engineering company, but who was very interested in the application of reinforced concrete to architectural purposes, not just engineering. And with that in mind, he moved to the firm Keir, J.L. Keir, the building contractor, and proceeded to, as it were, serve Tecton, really moonlighting in the evenings, because, I mean, he wasn't a consulting engineer at this point, but he and Lubetkin formed a very strong bond, and he collaborated with Lubetkin on all of Tecton's projects right into the post-war period. So this was a crucial partnership, in effect, between Arup and Lubetkin. Now, his work, I've tried to sort of structure it in a way that might make sense, but obviously I'm trying to condense this as well. So there are 5 little chapters, if I can put it like that, which I've titled in that way. So let's start with nature study. Now, Lubetkin always used to say the great irony of coming to England to build homes for heroes was that he found himself building homes for penguins in the first instance. And unlikely as it might seem, his first real commissions came from London Zoo, which was quite a well-established, well, it had been on the go for 100 years by this stage. It was the first purpose-built zoo. And something very interesting was happening at this stage. I mean, it had moved from being a sort of exhibition of curiosities where wild animals were imprisoned behind bars into something much more scientific and liberated. And the 2 people at the zoo who were very keen to take Lubetkin on and give him a chance were Solly Zuckerman, who was the chief anatomist, and Chalmers Mitchell, who was the secretary of the zoo, who was described by everybody, I never met him, but by everybody who did, as a very advanced man. And they really promoted Lubetkin and Tecton as the chosen architects of London Zoo, which in the 30s, in effect, went through perhaps its golden period. Now, the other person you see there, Carl Hagenbeck, had been developing what was then regarded as the progressive wisdom in how captive animals should be displayed, which was that they should be, so far as possible, accommodated in naturalistic surroundings. One should create a sort of faux jungle and see the animals in what might normally be regarded as their normal habitat. But Lubetkin took a different attitude to this. Of course, he was entirely concerned with the well-being of captive animals. There was no question about that. But he developed what he described as his geometric method of displaying animals. The idea being that they should, as it were, provide a more positive interactive experience between the animals and the public, and that animals that might otherwise be inclined to hide away under the undergrowth and become virtually invisible to the visiting public should, as it were, be given an opportunity to display their most typical characteristics. So the first project that they designed was this building, extraordinary building, which still exists, the Gorilla House in 1933, incredibly ambitious, with rotating screens and a removable roof. The idea being that the gorillas, which of course we all think of as being immensely strong creatures, in fact have quite vulnerable lungs and were therefore susceptible to possible diseases during the winter if they were outside. And therefore they should be displayed within the enclosure with the public passing through the center here during the winter months. And during the summer, the walls and the roof would be rolled away and the animals would occupy the entire cage and the public would process around the outside. This was sufficiently sort of unusual that the zoo didn't really know quite what they'd got when this thing appeared, that they engaged Lubetkin really for the rest of the decade because clearly new things were going to happen. And the next project, the Penguin Pool of 1934, in effect became a sort of mascot for the British modern movement. I mean, it was published everywhere, I mean, despite the fact that this is a tiny, tiny building. Of course, those intersecting ramps were an idea which Lubetkin would have been familiar with from his experience in Russia. And here you've got Tatlin's Tower, which of course was going to be this leviathan of cast iron and so on, when there wouldn't have been enough iron in the whole of Russia to make this thing. Here it is being pulled through Moscow on May Day in 1920, made of wood. And then, of course, there were other motifs that would certainly have been in his mind. For example, the theatre sets of Meyerhold, where you get this sort of proscenium surrounding to a sort of a central area where all the activity is going on. But Lubetkin always sort of fuses these things and translates them into his own distinctive idea. Here are some sketches. Very few Lubetkin drawings survive, actually, drawings in his own hand, but this is one. And you can see him beginning to work out the ingredients of this building, which of course become refined and refined and refined until it becomes this almost totally abstract conception. But here again, you see this diametry, as Lubetkin called it, coming through, perhaps influenced from that extraordinary plan of the Soviet pavilion of 1925. The Penguin Pool equally works around this idea that these different features play off on alternate diagonal sides of the enclosure. In fact, all of those things, I've numbered them from 1 to 5, all of them, as it were, answer each other across the plan. And of course, the structural aspect of the ramps was another extraordinary achievement. Arup, of course, having a key part in this. Here he is, standing in the middle, pipe on the go. But we must also mention the engineer Felix Samueli, who had arrived more or less at exactly the same time that the Penguin Pool was being developed. And the key thing I want to point out here, and this is a feature of Lubetkin and Arup's collaboration, is that they were absolutely clear about the structure being expressed when it was significant and suppressed when it wasn't. In fact, the reality of those ramps is what I've drawn here. You have these two enormous abutments at each end of each ramp, but these are concealed in the accommodation on the perimeter of the plan. So everything within the red box is sort of camouflaged, is hidden, and what you see is really these unaccountably delicate ramps. And there are some very interesting refinements. For example, the inner edge of the ramp is 6 inches thick, the outer edge is 3. The outer edge, which you tend to see, the inner one, which is perhaps just that less prominent, but of course the inner one is the shorter journey, so it's doing a job of helping to cantilever across the width of the ramp. It's all beautifully worked out. Well, they continued their work with the zoo. The zoo opened its new country park in Whipsnade in the early 30s, and you can see some of these ideas playing out. Almost all of these buildings are sort of based on a geometrical figure, and there's a kind of a lyrical element to them as well. Here you could perhaps suggest that that classical influence from Perret and the French rationalist was coming through. This is the Elephant House at Whipsnade. Absolutely symmetrically organized. The entrance at Dudley Zoo, which came a little bit later, where again he's using reinforced concrete in this sort of playful way. Polar bear exhibit. Now, of course, it goes without saying that the sort of culture of exhibiting captive animals was a very different thing then than it is now. But I mean, we're talking about then. And just to show you some of the plans of these buildings, you can see this kind of discipline of refining the idea into a geometrical figure, and in almost every case it's organized around a central axis. But then at the bottom you can equally see, this is the penguin pool at Dudley Zoo, alas now demolished illegally, that discipline is then played with this sort of lyrical arrangement of platforms and ramps. And equally at Dudley, there's another idea going on, which is the positioning of all of these pavilions within this really rather extraordinary site, a hilltop in the West Midlands with an ancient castle at the top, where the comparison Lubetkin made was with the sort of classical landscape of previous centuries. This picture is actually from one of Lubetkin's own pattern books, Jardinier Paysagiste, and he himself would refer back to some of his early experiences in Russia, where the way in which the architecture is juxtaposed against the landscape so that it's perfectly clear that there is a man-made introduction, an intervention, which is set off in contrast to the natural background, although it has to be said that the natural background is itself equally contrived. It's a sort of conceit, really. Again, he would refer to places like Stourhead in England, where you see these little pavilions, as it were, placed, giving a kind of a human dimension to what is otherwise a natural landscape. And the phrase that Lubetkin most often used was that his vision of these zoological exhibits and the landscape they're sat in was one of nature tamed, not with a fist, but with a smile. So the next little chapter, which I've called Manifesto, and this is really to do with the buildings at High Point in Highgate, North London. And they could be regarded as a manifesto in a number of ways. Firstly, in the subtitle there, The Vertical Garden City, in suggesting an alternative to what was then really the prevalence of suburban sprawl, not just in London, but across England generally, where acres and acres of countryside were being consumed by small semi-detached houses. The other way of looking at developing urban land, which Lubetkin wanted to represent, was by compact apartment living that left the majority of the site available for recreational use. Now, at this time, it would be possible to say that nothing of the nature of Lubetkin's proposition had ever been built. This was the sort of state of development of apartment living, the traditional sort of Edwardian mansion block with these hideously convoluted plans, not really very appealing at all. And for that reason, apartment living really had a somewhat damaged reputation. Lubetkin wanted to change all of that. And so you get High Point 1, this sort of trim, slim, sleek building where everybody has a good outlook, the gardens are there for everybody to enjoy. And in the ground floor and the arrangement of it, we get this very elegant adaptation of what I think architects will recognize as the promenade architecturale, which of course Le Corbusier had developed at the Villa Savoye a few years earlier, where you arrive in your motor car and process from the ground level up by ramps or staircases and eventually arrive at the rooftop terrace, as it were, reconnecting you between the city and nature. And at High Point, we see much the same idea being played out. This is the ground floor plan. And you see, you arrive at the left-hand side of the image there. Your car sweeps under the porte cochere. You arrive at the main entrance. You process through this sort of beautifully obliquely aligned foyer, return under the main building, and then process to the right there, and then re-engage with nature and the gardens beyond. So we'll do that journey now by images. So here we are arriving under the porte cochere, High Point 1, through into the hallway, the foyer, up onto the landing, beyond down to what was originally a tea room, and then down this sort of serpentine ramp which reconnects you with these absolutely luscious gardens on the south side. On the upper levels, there's equal amount of ingenuity. You get 4 plans, or 4 apartment plans, organized in this double cruciform, with the core ostensibly buried in the middle of the block, and therefore one might think dark and rather depressing. But in fact, it's none of that at all. He uses this diagonal arrangement of drying balconies on opposite corners, diametry again, and then borrows the light again into the center of the plan. And very beautifully, the counterweight for the lift car is actually placed in the service shaft of the service lift on one of the other corners, so that when you're waiting for the lift, instead of seeing the counterbalance come down and sort of emphasizing how heavy it is, in fact, the car just sort of levitates apparently effortlessly. It's a very beautiful refinement. Here's a diagrammatic explanation of that arrangement there. The lift shaft, of course, was wrapped in wire rather than solid material, so that the light goes all the way through, and you get some sense of how light it is in that picture of a typical landing. There were 2 types of flats, the smaller ones on the spine, the larger ones on the wings, and some very interesting structural arrangements going on. Here again, you see Arup and Lubetkin collaborating in suppressing structure where it was not significant, but expressing it in the case of this rather beautiful freestanding column that you get in the hallway there. The main spine beam is actually concealed within a cupboard zone, so the floor span is halved. And then, of course, the circulation, rather different from those Edwardian plans that we saw, is arranged through the rooms so that there isn't some dark central corridor, and the space that would otherwise be lost in that corridor is given to the main living area. Other beautiful devices include these sliding folding windows. Here you see them in the closed position and in the open position, very much enjoyed by the residents and their cats. And this again is part of this sort of reconnecting the inhabitants with the gardens, turning the whole living room into a sort of balcony. The structure itself was very advanced for its time, and this is where Arup came into his own. This form of slip form shuttering, which would have been extraordinary to see in England at that time. I mean, normally a building like this would have been completely wrapped in scaffolding. But here the slip form works its way up the building, casting a floor at a time and then bringing the walls up behind it, producing this very beautiful, sleek, monolithic, thin wall concrete carcass. And the other respect in which it could be called a manifesto is the way in which Lubetkin presented his work. All of his projects are not only drawn for construction, but then redrawn for explanation and clarification and really education for anyone who was interested. And you here are just a couple of a whole sequence of drawings that Tecton produced, presenting their solutions, not as the only possible solution, but as the chosen solution and the reasons for that choice. If we just look at one of those details, you can see the way in which he compares the chosen solution for the window catches, for example, with what might otherwise have been the conventional solution, with the window catch obscuring the glazed opening, this very awkward window stay on the bottom left there, as compared with a friction pivot that would allow you to clean the windows from the inside. Every single detail was interrogated and refined and rethought where a better solution was possible. And of course, Corbusier himself recognized the achievement of High Point 1. Lubetkin asked him over to visit the building, and he described it in this way, an achievement of the first rank, a milestone that will be useful to everybody. 3 years later, the adjacent site became available and High Point 2, as it was called, was built. The planning conditions made this a very different proposition from High Point 1, which had originally contained 60 flats. High Point 2 only contained 16, with the result that in order to, as it were, balance the developer's equation, they had to be that much more valuable. And they also advanced, in a somewhat controversial way at the time, people's ideas of what modern architecture could be or was becoming. High Point 2, by virtue of this different program, in fact has a different structure. The central flats are planned as very generous duplex units. You can see that it goes from monolithic to frame structure in the center. And where the frame structure occurs, of course, you have an infill architectural vocabulary rather than a monolithic one. And you can see that coming through very clearly if you compare the elevations of High Point 1 and 2. This was really architecture moving from its kind of international style convention where everything seemed to be made out of one material, almost as one object, into architecture as a process of assembly. And Lubetkin was absolutely at the forefront of trying to demonstrate that architecture that was assembled of components could itself be capable of poetry in its own way. There you see the central duplex flats marked out. And of course, by this stage, there were other arguments to prove. And in this particular case, the entrance to High Point 2, which was far more elaborate and sort of opulent than High Point 1. And Lubetkin saw an opportunity to kind of offend the routine functionalists, as he would call them, by using 2,000-year-old casts of Greek caryatids to support the entrance canopy. And just to rub their noses in it, he produced a kind of a typical Tecton analysis of why that was really the only reasonable solution to adopt. Having no columns would be too light. Having columns the same size as the ones supporting the buildings would be too heavy. Using metal poles would be too thin. And if you commissioned a sculptor to do that, Henry Moore, for example, then it would be too personal. The building would all be about Henry Moore. He didn't want that. Whereas the caryatids from the Acropolis were these sort of timeless, universal symbols of how to carry something without making it look heavy. And the structure that enables them to do that is pretty clever. In fact, the caryatids support a beam, but they only support one end of the canopy. The other end is supported by a cantilever which is brought out from the main building. So these two girls are supporting this enormous canopy quite effortlessly. I mean, just the sort of impression Lubetkin wanted to give. You see that here. And then from the inside of the foyer. And then the arrangement of the circulation is also very ingenious. The lifts themselves actually go from the ground floor foyer and deliver residents and guests directly into their apartments. That's the blue shaded area there, whereas services and so on are brought up in the service lifts, the red lifts there. I don't think that had ever been done in England before anyway, so when the lift doors open, your host is there to greet you. There's no intermediate lobby. This is an image of one of the duplex apartments, which we had the pleasure of restoring a few years ago. And of course, there were 6 staircases to design in the central duplex units. Lubetkin, of course, would never have settled for one design for all 6 of them, so they all have slightly different staircases. So there's a sort of personal, individual touch to each of these wonderful flats. And finally, to crown it, Lubetkin's penthouse, which he persuaded the client, who I should have mentioned, Sigmund Gestetner, who was a major manufacturer of office equipment. You probably come across the term Gestetner, which was the sort of the common word for a copying machine, but it was actually Gestetner's name. They were major employers in North London. Well, he managed to persuade Gestetner to pay for his own flat at the top of the building. And Lubetkin's penthouse really is as close to understanding and sort of apprehending Lubetkin's personality as it's possible to get without meeting the man himself. You get some idea of the intensely personal vision that you see acted out in this flat that he built for himself and his wife, Margaret. Now, we had the pleasure of restoring this a few years ago as well. I just want to pick out one detail. These 2 walls either side of the entrance to the kitchen, which you see are sort of fly-posted with Pollock's theatre prints from Pollock's Theatre Museum. And what we discovered, which was so sort of typical really, but quite fascinating, was that Lubetkin must have planned the width of those 2 walls in order to suit 5 strips of these theatre prints without having to cut any of them. They fitted exactly. So you can see those 5 strips just perfectly worked out. And some of the sort of idiosyncratic choices in terms of furniture, which was homemade, Calder mobiles, that face you see in the middle, which was hung in the fireplace so that it would make sort of stupid expressions as the sort of air of the fireplace wafted past. The expression on that face would change. It was all sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek, a joke in a way, but a deadly serious joke. What he was really saying was modern architecture does not have to be this sort of hygienic, anonymous, international thing, which, as it were, isn't part of or isn't rooted in some culture or local circumstances. Modern architecture can, as it were, tell a particular story in a particular way. Here's one of the fortunate occupants of that flat now. And that's the view you get when you walk along Hampstead Heath and see High Point waving at you from the distance. This is a walk that my wife and I do most Sundays. And when the sun's in the right position, it's a very wonderful and gratifying sight to see High Point in the horizon. So you might wonder what happened to Lubetkin's ambitions to do buildings that were part of some sort of social program. Well, he did get that opportunity, and in 1935, he was commissioned by Finsbury Borough Council, which was a very socialist-minded, left-leaning and progressive borough in East London, to design a health centre. And the background in which this took place can be sort of best encapsulated by just glancing at some of these statistics. It was an extremely deprived, a really desperate situation in inner London, where you can see from some of these statistics, the quality of life was really appalling. And the two people who were driving this program, Harold Riley and Dr. Katyal, had conceived this idea of really getting to grips with the social situation in Finsbury by designing new health facilities and also dealing with the vast amount of slum clearance that had to be done and developing a whole new housing program. Well, in the pre-war context, it was only Finsbury Health Centre that Lubetkin was able to achieve. The housing came later. But you see some of the clinics that were offered in Finsbury. I mean, to give you an idea, that top right picture of those little kids, they're getting ultraviolet light treatment for vitamin D deficiency, which, you know, was a very common cause of rickets in London at the time because of the air quality was so appalling. Bottom left there, it was one of the first women's clinics. I mean, this was a huge step forward. And you see the whole plan organized on this almost perfect Beaux-Arts symmetrical arrangement where you have services in the basement, clinics on the ground floor and offices on the upper floor, the clinics and so on being in the wings, the central services, reception and so forth being in the central, the sort of armature which brings them together. And you can perhaps imagine the kind of impact this building would make in the context, the local context of Finsbury at the time, this sort of sooty, rat-infested slum area of London. It must have seemed absolutely extraordinary, a sort of spaceship, really. And of course, that kind of dynamic, the kind of impact of that building, surely has resonances with some of Lubetkin's earlier experiences. And specifically, the one I always kind of bring up at this point is Ludzicki's famous image, "Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge," and the way in which that lecture theatre is sort of rammed into the centre of the building as this sort of rhetorical, this is where health education is going to happen. And of course, you can see some of the themes being played out from his earlier works, the Palace of Soviets, for example, where you get this symmetrical arrangement of wings and centre. And even, if one really looks closely enough, one could see a resonance with the school that Lubetkin attended in Paris, the École des Beaux-Arts, where you see a read across between these plans. I mean, I'll just run through the sort of resonances, the lecture theatre, the service areas, the wings. It's all there, really. But Lubetkin fuses it into this sort of constructivist modern proposition. The interior was arranged in an informal way, the idea being that people should not be intimidated by walking into this building and sort of being confronted by the sort of hostile medics. The idea was it should have the ambience of a club and people should be encouraged to come in and not necessarily even with an appointment and then speak to a nurse or an assistant when they felt sufficiently confident in sharing their medical concerns. And much of the building itself was used for health promotional purposes. I mean, these murals that were commissioned for the rear walls, which have all sorts of very encouraging slogans like chest diseases are preventable and curable, which, you know, in a situation where 40,000 people were dying every year from tuberculosis, would have been a very encouraging thing to read. The other extraordinary thing about Finsbury, and I think probably unparalleled in early modern architecture, in England anyway at that time, was the way in which the services, all aspects of the building, are fully integrated. The services aren't added in later, as it were, they're all thought through from the very beginning. The structure itself was arranged in such a way that there should be no internal load-bearing walls, the expectation being that changing clinical programs would necessitate revision of the internal wall layout, which indeed has happened. And again, you see the way in which all of these different parts of a building, every bit of a building that an architect has to think about, is all beautifully integrated. There's the lecture theatre on the upper floor, the terrace, the emphasis on fresh air, sunlight. And of course, the entrance itself, where Lubetkin is always concerned to use the most valuable materials in the position where most people experience them. bronze doors, marble surround, and this municipal crest that right over the centre saying, this is a municipal offer, we're on your side, a sort of guarantee to the layman, the people of Finsbury, that they could trust their municipal authority. And you see some of the ways in which, in his earlier buildings, a couple on the right there, that way of elaborating an entrance is worked out. And indeed, Finsbury Health Centre was one of the images that was used as a morale-boosting poster for Allied soldiers during the war. This poster, "Your Britain, fight for it now." So we're getting through these different sections of his work, and penultimately, this section I've called urban engagement, because Lubetkin did eventually have the opportunity to develop major housing projects in Finsbury. The first one being Spa Green, just half a mile from Finsbury Health Centre. And you can see how they all fit together. Finsbury Health Centre down below there, Spa Green, Busaco Street as it was called at the top left, and Holford Square. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to point out two things. Those are the plans of those estates. And I think you can see that Lubetkin geometrical formulation working itself through, and the way in which the landscape is sort of deliberately contrived as a sort of naturalistic foil to these formally arranged buildings. Spa Green, which was the first to be completed in 1950, takes the development of their structural ideas another step further. We started at High Point 1 with this monolithic panel and slab. Then there was the hybrid arrangement of High Point 2, and by the time we get to Spa Green and the post-war flats, we're into what was then called box frame construction. But this really presented a whole new set of problems. I mean, these buildings were far bigger than High Points 1 or 2, and Lubetkin's self-imposed challenge really was to try and get to grips with the architectural responsibility of dealing with the facades of these buildings. Now, most modernists were really too inhibited to acknowledge that the facade was an architectural responsibility, and that once the internal planning had been resolved, then the facade would somehow solve itself. But Lubetkin went back to his early inspiration from carpets and realized that there were different ways of infilling, as it were, the box frame. So that in a typical sort of didactic cartoon that Tecton would produce, you get the functionalist notion of how a building which consisted of several hundred identical windows would be arranged. But in Lubetkin's hand, it becomes a composition. It becomes framed, scaled, animated. It becomes something that's an architectural responsibility. And if you look at Spa Green, you can see the way those ideas are working their way through in the sort of different ways the balcony frontages are arranged alternately on different sides and different levels. And then in the smaller block, you can see how, in this case, a particular Keelium that Lubetkin was very fond of is used as a sort of inspiration for modeling that animated checkerboard pattern into the thickness of the building itself. In the case of Bevan Court, there's another little lesson there which becomes clearer in the final section, which is the way Lubetkin is concerned to relate his buildings to the local geography and the local townscape. In this case, a very interesting arrangement of geometrical terraces and, in this case, a circus, in the sense of a townscape circus, that's to say, an arrangement of buildings around this central garden. And Bevan Court, as it were, vectors in on that centre, and the geometry there is then imported right into the heart of the building itself. So you see, first of all, this little entrance porch, which was decorated with this beautiful mural by his colleague Peter Yates, illustrating various motifs from London's history, into the central stair hall, where you get that idea of the three-winged block being played out in the organization of the staircase, whereby you go up a dogleg, half the floor height, you veer off 120 degrees, another half flight, another 120 degrees, and back, so that every third floor you return, as it were, to the same orientation from where you started, which produces this wonderful sculptural staircase in the center of the block. And it's really all part of Lubetkin's concern to sort of exalt the communal parts of these buildings in a time when the individual details of dwelling plans and so forth were becoming increasingly regulated. The bits of the architecture that Lubetkin could still play with, he did his utmost to kind of turn into something greater to celebrate those communal areas. This was a quote which I chose simply to illustrate some of this wonderful array of staircases which you can find in some of his social housing projects. So finally, what I call, or what he used to call, the spatial vector. And we have to go all the way back to St. Petersburg, to an area which made a profound impression on Lubetkin when he was a young man. And this is the Strelka, if people here are familiar with the layout of St. Petersburg, where the Neva divides on its way out to the Gulf of Finland, divides either side of this, of the Bursa, the exchange. And in Lubetkin's book, there was a lesson here, which is the way in which buildings could, as it were, establish meaningful relationships with each other across space. In the new arrangements and the new culture of city planning, certainly in England, it was not going to be possible to build whole Georgian terraces and as it were, make sense of the urban framework by joining things up. Buildings would have to try and establish meaningful relationships with each other across space. And this was a lesson he'd learned really almost as a boy when he lived in Petersburg. And these three buildings, I mean, these are somewhat blurred pictures of mine from many years ago, in fact, talk to each other across this vast distance. And this was another aspect of his experience in Paris, which meant so much to him, the way in which sort of spatial energy was transmitted across a city by the connections between different buildings. Meanwhile, in England at this stage, there were sort of two ideas on the go. Townscape, which was a very British way of trying to get to grips with how to replan city centres, including bombed out city centres, where you would sort of contrive these rather accidental, on purpose, romantic, picturesque views of things suddenly coming into view, or on the other hand, the kind of megastructure that new architecture required new types of buildings altogether, huge buildings that would straddle across whole bits of city and usually characterized as streets in the air. Lubetkin rejected both of those formulations, and as you can perhaps just see from some of the ways in which those estates are trying to interconnect with their surroundings, he was interested in this idea of establishing connections across space. And his last significant opportunity to demonstrate this was a housing estate in Bethnal Green in East London, where in fact there was a legitimate connection between the market place on the bottom left of this site and Victoria Park, which is a huge urban park in East London, which provided the pretext for an axis, that diagonal axis again, that went all the way through the estate. And it's answered in its turn by the extrapolation of an adjacent road from the northwest. And then you see that principle of diametry playing itself out, not just in the axis on the route, the pedestrian route, but also in the way that the buildings themselves interrelate with each other. Here we are back with Melnikov's plan of 1925 again, and that axis that leads from the market to the park. The buildings themselves are paired off in such a way that each building of the same height is orientated in the same way as its first cousin, if you like, and then that plays out across the extent of the site. As you see here, it could have started as an arrangement of simply identical towers, but then they're scaled down to, as it were, become more assimilated with the surroundings, and then each building is orientated towards its neighbour across space. So here you see it built out, and there the intended axis to get from the market to the park. But in fact, it never happened. the council failed to acquire the final segment of site that would have enabled the connection to be made. So Lubetkin was invited back to make some sense of this truncated axis and the view. So what does he do? He goes back into history and finds the precedent he's looking for in the Palazzo Spada in Rome, where some of you may be familiar with the Galleria, as it's called, by Borromini, where this sort of trompe-l'oeil effect is created by artificially shortening the distance along this gallery. And this is Lubetkin's equivalent. It was his last significant work, and it inclines me, as I hope I've tried to convey in the talk, to place Lubetkin in a different category. As I said at the beginning, that history and the past for him was not something you either copied or rejected. It was something you had to somehow metabolize. And it seems to me that there is another kind of modernity going on here. I perhaps unfairly caricatured some of the figures in the top strip there, but certainly Lubetkin belongs in the slightly more idiomatic, metaphoric, other tradition of modernity that we associate with some of those other artists. Anyway, he eventually received the Royal Gold Medal. He had become a recluse by about 1970 when I first met him, and was finally persuaded to accept this medal on 29th of June 1982, where he opened his remarks with this rather unforgettable definition of architecture, before going on to deliver an absolutely devastating philippic against modern architecture as it had developed. So this is Lubetkin, who I'm proud to call my friend, with all of these characteristics, which, as far as I'm concerned, have been the inspiration of a lifetime. That was part one. Part two is much shorter. This is just to finish off by covering a couple of projects that I had the pleasure and the privilege of working on. First of all, the Penguin Pool, which sort of came to us by a route that's probably too convoluted and difficult to explain now. Just briefly to say that the developer and artistic patron, Peter Palumbo, had been attempting to build this building by Mies van der Rohe in the city of London. Some of you may know about this struggle. It was the subject of an exhibition a couple of years ago. Lubetkin was asked by Palumbo to serve as an expert witness at the planning inquiry, which he did. Palumbo, I think in an act of gratitude and recognition, offered to help restore the Penguin Pool. And here's that chap again, getting started in 1986. Palumbo, in his generosity, suggested that I should take responsibility for leading the project. And the Penguin Pool by this stage was in a pretty desperate state. It hadn't been well looked after latterly by the zoo, and it really needed a comprehensive restoration. The zoo itself needed or asked for certain adaptations because various things had changed since the original building was designed. For one thing, they kept a different species of penguin there, not the Antarctic variety, but the South African variety, which Lubetkin referred to as more suburban in their habit. They preferred to live further apart from each other. The Antarctic ones have to keep warm by huddling together. So it actually produced quite a different brief so far as the arrangement of nesting boxes were concerned. So we had to work on that. But of course, the fabric of the building itself was in dire need of attention. I think there were 11 subsequent layers of overcoating to the original concrete structure. They all had to be taken back to get something sound to work with. And this is some of the work in progress. The diving tank was another feature that the zoo wanted to be altered. In fact, the original one was quite small, and Lubetkin's suggestion for how it could be enlarged is indicated in this drawing, probably the last drawing he ever did, dated August 1985. Well, I had to get to grips with what I sensed was his intention by this drawing, and in the best tectonic tradition, tried to produce as many alternatives as possible, and then argue for which ones might be more suitable. Interestingly, the meeting we had with English Heritage, the government's heritage advisor. The officer there, against Lubetkin's advice, preferred the option that I myself had preferred. So I learned a little lesson there. And I thought it took some temerity on the part of the English Heritage officer to go against Lubetkin, who was sitting in the same meeting. The point being that the canted sides of the diving tank, which you see represented in a few of those options, he regarded as a feature dating from a slightly later stage in Lubetkin's work, whereas the straight-sided ones were more, as it were, in tune with the original intentions of the pool. So I felt slightly gratified about that. But I did learn a little lesson, which was in conservation work, it is most likely the original building from which you take your final lessons, not necessarily the original architect. Although, of course, having the original architect around can be enormously valuable. So that's what we eventually built. Very complicated it was as well. The nesting boxes coming out here. So there's the diving tank before and after. We had a nice task of redesigning the signage on the structure. And then, of course, the floor was repaved with new mosaic. The undersides of the ramp were actually originally blue, although Lubetkin had forgotten that. But we rediscovered that when removing paint scrapes from the concrete, restoring the colors of the surrounding paving with that diameter you can see working across. There was a nice moment when the pool was refilled and we got all those reflections back. And then, of course, when the inhabitants were readmitted, they seemed slightly nonplussed and kept together, at least for the first several hours, not being quite sure that they were going back into their original home, I think. And then a rather nice moment when the pool was formally reopened, when the old collaborators were reunited, Arup on the left, of course, and Lubetkin on the right, still arguing about some details of the ramps. Lubetkin accused Arup of originally suggesting that they should be supported by stub columns all along the center. Arup denied all knowledge of that, so he'd never suggested that. And so, this is the engineer-architect relationship as we know it. But the project was enormously important for us, or for me, in terms of establishing us as architects who could work with early modern buildings. And it led more or less directly onto the second one, which I'll rush through now. This is Finsbury Health Centre, which has been on the go for years. This is 1988, where the 50th anniversary provided the pretext for some sort of celebration, and Lubetkin was brought back to the building for a celebratory lunch, and we all thought that a restoration project was going to be initiated. In fact, by this stage, the building was looking pretty tired. You get some sense of the condition of it. But our budget didn't allow us to do more than simply a kind of token amount of work, and we decided we should use it in such a way as to demonstrate what would happen if and when the budget was available to do all of the rest. So we just chose certain pieces of the building and did the best job we could in those, rather than spreading the money over everywhere and not doing it really well enough. So the roof obviously had to be done, it always does. It's not a glamorous way to spend slender resources, but it still has to be done. We used realkalization as the technique for remediating the concrete. Some of you may be familiar with that if you worked with reinforced concrete buildings, but the important thing here was it enabled us to keep the building in use while the work was being done, whereas traditional replacement of damaged mortar can be a very disruptive activity, and we would have had to have decanted the services from the building, which would have been almost impossible to achieve. That shows the outcome there. The terrace before work, during it, and afterwards. The curtain wall, it was one of the earliest curtain walls in London at the time, which was really, although on a modest scale, very advanced for its time. It had been replaced more than once. The building had been used as a casualty station during the war and been sandbagged right up to the top level of windows, The result being, of course, that the weight of the sandbags had pressed against the curtain wall and broken all of those spandrel panels. They had all been replaced with extremely inauthentic alternatives. You get some sense, in some cases, it was just plywood panels. So our task was to try and replace the original Thermolux as a material made in Germany, which unfortunately is no longer available in the original colour. When I questioned Lubetkin about what the colour was originally like, all he could tell me was that they shone like a girlfriend's hair, which wasn't sufficiently accurate for me to be able to. I mean, this was before he was married, so there may have been more than one girlfriend involved. So, anyway, we finally did find a fragment of one of those panels in the duct, because builders are generally messy people. They don't clear up fully afterwards. So we found a fragment, managed to analyze it and establish the color from that, a color that is no longer made. So what we did was use white Thermolux. That little box here is trying to explain what we arrived at. White Thermolux for an inner panel to give the texture of those panels, and then an outer level, an outer panel which was made of laminated glass with the color being achieved through the color of the laminate. It had the additional advantage of providing protection for the much more expensive Thermolux panel behind it. So in a way, although it's not quite authentic, it does produce an authentic result and helps to protect the panels that are there. So you see the before and after equivalents. You can perhaps just about make out that rather beautiful, strandy, sort of angel hair effect of the Thermolux, which is sort of showing through the outer panel. The window replacement had its own problems. The original windows were very beautifully designed, as you would expect, with these double outward opening casements, pivot mounted with no central mullion, so you get this wonderful open effect when both windows are in use. We were able to replace almost identical windows and reuse some of the original fittings, these pivot hinges and the bronze handles. We had a very good relationship with the window manufacturer. And then, of course, we reiterated that original play, typically Lubetkin, of the top lights and sublights alternating across the facade. Tiling had its own problems. The original tiles had been bedded on cement on the original concrete, which is not how you do tiling now. That picture, which indicates an area of about 12 damaged tiles, in fact, the latent damage beyond that area would have been more than double, triple that amount. So we felt there was really an alternative but to retile the wing that we were working on. We worked through any number of alternatives to get the right color, the right reflectivity, etc. You can see some of this going on. Architect nervously examining the work in progress. But we retained the coping stones along the top, which are faience coping stones, which provided the grid for the tiling. One coping stone equals 2 tiles. So it was very helpful to be able to work down from those. And finally, the sign, this wonderful trompe-l'oeil signage, which had actually been used at High Point 2, a font called Thorn Shaded, where the shadow is actually included in the signage itself. And the letters are then spaced off the backboard. So you get, for what is really quite a small letter, a very dramatic effect. But that was all 30 years ago, and since then, no money has been made available to complete the project that we hoped we would be able to do. There was an anxious moment. This is in 2009, a piece from the Architect's Journal, where for one rather worrying moment, it appeared that the building might be sold. In fact, it hasn't been sold. The campaign goes on using the original poster from that original pre-war slogan, "Your Britain, fight for it now." We've provided images of the building of what it could be and should be to try and, as it were, establish some morale in the building owner. The problem is, of course, as you may or may not know, the NHS in our country is in a state of constant turmoil. So our problem has been to work with an ever-changing type of ownership, because the way in which the buildings are dealt with, as distinct from the services, makes for a sort of ongoing difficulty. However, in the words of the original motto over the centre, Altiora petimus, we strive for better things. So here is my friend again, reunited with the penguin. And finally, since this linkage of Lubetkin and penguins somehow seems to be a sort of leitmotif of his story, it actually produced what could have been your almost local Australian Lubetkin project, because on account of a word search that linked the word penguin with the word architect, Lubetkin was approached by your Directorate of Conservation, Forests and Lands in 1986 to ask if he would design a concept for the visitor facility at Penguin Island, just south of Melbourne. Well, Lubetkin became very interested in this and, in all seriousness, provided a proposal which was not, as one might have expected, a very sort of fanciful array of ramps and galleries and so forth, but something completely different. His proposal was for a reinforced concrete barge which could be anchored closely to the coastline. And in the words of his letter to a gentleman called Tony Edison, who was then Director General of the Department of Conservation, Forests and Lands, he says, the idea behind it is that the penguins ought to be spared any discomfort during the period of construction. If this reasoning is basic, I would have thought that the structure containing the viewing stands, kiosk, etc., could be built elsewhere and then towed into the proximity of the Phillip Island Reserve. I've spoken to the marine zoologists about the permanence of the existing conditions of the penguins, and although they think that the cold currents are more or less permanent, thus providing stable conditions for the birds, there is a possibility of pilchards and anchovies migrating as they did in Peru and in Southwest Africa. In those conditions, a permanent display might be wasted, and if a reinforced concrete barge is acceptable, this in itself could be moved to any new location. So here's Lubetkin in his late 80s, still thinking laterally, still using technology as a key to find a new solution, and still, I think, proving that he was on the side of progress. But if you want to learn more, you'll just have to read my book. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for an insightful presentation. My question is, in your life with Lubetkin, did you get a sense on how his lateral thinking came about, the context in which these innovative moments took place? Did he listen to Bach? Did he drink vodka? Did he go for long walks? Give me a sense on how did this artist work and the context in which he worked.
Yeah, sure. I never caught him listening to Bach, but he certainly drank vodka, and he also drank very good single malt whiskey, so I never failed to take him a bottle whenever I visited him, which at one stage was probably twice a month over a period of 20 years or so. But I mean, to give you a serious answer to that, which is a very illuminating subject actually, was how do different architects work? Well, I said a little bit about Tecton earlier on, but what's interesting about Lubetkin, who was the archetypal loner, he didn't join anything, he never joined the RIBA. Eventually he was persuaded to be elected a member of the Royal Academy, but he said the only reason he had agreed to do that was because of the convenience of being able to park opposite Fortnum and Mason. But the point is, his way of working was through his collaborators. He very seldom, I said earlier that there are very few drawings to be found in Lubetkin's hand. On the other hand, the practice and one or two of the members of the practice were prolific in working out alternative ideas. every concept might have been drawn dozens of times. The solution didn't come to him, you know, as it were, out of his brow like Minerva or whatever the expression is. It came through working through ideas, refining them and refining them. He used to say that the secret of architecture lies in the 10-inch tracing roll. In other words, you would draw something, draw it again, draw it again, draw it again. And you can see, I think, in all of the plans and really all of the projects, a process of refinement going on, which is a way of working out an idea. Of course, the original, the motif, if you like, was invariably, or almost invariably, produced by Lubetkin. All of his partners were ready to acknowledge that. He led on design in pretty well every project. But then the way he used his practice was to set up often alternative and sometimes competing ideas within the office to see how the ideas were working out. I mean, in the case of some of the post-war housing estates, where some of those facade elevations, they might have been drawn 50 times with perhaps a tiny alteration in a glazing bar between option 38 and option 39. His colleagues would draw all these out equally with no particular favor to one or another, and Lubetkin would make his choice. So it was a process of working through. It wasn't a kind of God-given inspirational moment, although he was intensely clever at translating a set of social or architectural programmatic requirements into a diagram. He would be able to realize that in the case of the zoo buildings, for example, you know, an elephant house could be conceived as a series of drums with a canopy. You know, he would produce the diagram and then work on the diagram, refine it and refine it. So does that go some way to answering your question? In other words, he relied on his collaborators just as they relied on him. And what's so interesting, I find, is that throughout his entire career, this loner, this person who was very difficult to get to know, is never to be found working on his own. He always worked with collaborators. They supported him in what he was searching to achieve.
John, thanks for a very enigmatic display of ideas that one would have expected to spread more widely in Britain in that period. But looking at them and the feel of them, you feel associated with the work of people like Berthold Lubetkin in the United States in the 40s. And do you think that Lubetkin was conscious of spreading ideas, or was he just that much of a reclusive person that he didn't care?
Well, he became a recluse in later life.
On, right.
Certainly, as I tried to suggest. I mean, I've had to sort of omit key parts of his story. You might ask why, what did he become so disillusioned about? But I mean, read chapter 10, it'll explain it. But I think, on the one hand, his readiness and sort of the energy he put into explaining his work in the way it was presented and promoted was absolutely unparalleled in the early modern movement in England, at any rate. I mean, his projects and their publication, he had a very good and strong relationship with the architectural press. They more or less took every Tecton project and published it in its entirety on completion. So he was very concerned to explain himself. I mean, notwithstanding what I've just said, architecture to him was not this mysterious thing that the layman couldn't be expected to understand. His projects were explicable, they were explained, they were presented and so forth. But the historian John Summerson, I don't know if that name means anything to some of you, he was a very distinguished British historian, wrote an interesting essay in the early post-war period when Lubetkin's star was beginning to fade, if you like. And he said that there's no doubt that Lubetkin and Tecton's projects were the most sophisticated architecture of their period, but for some curious reason, he said, they did not spark off invention in others. I may have got that slightly wrong, but I spent a long time thinking about that comment, and I sort of came to the conclusion that the reason that Tecton's work isn't copyable in the same way that Le Corbusier's work, I mean, Corbusier kind of had his whole intermediate layer of marketing, if you like, you know, the cinq points kind of thing. Those were ideas that any architect, including Lubetkin, could take away and adapt and use, as it were. But Lubetkin's projects are all highly refined, purified outcomes of a particular commission and a particular site. So, as I think I put in my book, there's no prose commentary, so to say, that goes with Lubetkin's finished products. They're all poetic evocations of a type of a sort of aspiration for, there's a sort of, they're reaching for another world. I mean, the way he described it was that architecture is a way of setting out the stage scenery in a play for the next act. You know, the next iteration of society, they will understand, you know, and so they're sort of poetic evocations, and whereas poetry can inspire, it's not easily emulated. And therefore, I would say the impact of his work, and he's still the subject of discourse, he's used in teaching. I mean, I give versions of this talk to students up and down England, and I think the impact of his work is more to do with the sort of its inspirational quality, that it conveys the sense of sort of artistic and social responsibility that architects should develop for themselves, as distinct from copying details and putting a curve here or a circle there. So it's more generalized, it's more aspirational perhaps, and more inspirational, I would say.